Hello and welcome to Module 1 of Name Your Brand. My name is Nigel, and hopefully you've watched the welcome intro. If you haven't, please do. There's a small task on there to do, which I think you might quite enjoy, and it will really help with some of the understanding behind brand naming. I just want to start this presentation by really sort of telling you a little bit about branding in general, and also more specifically about naming. So this is just a very general introduction, and then module 2 will be going into a little bit more detail of some of the prep work that you need to do before you actually even start thinking about naming. None of these things will take very long, and hopefully you'll find them all fun and enjoyable as well at the same time. So let's just have a little think about branding. Now, it's a question that's asked all the time, what is a brand? How do you create a brand? And for me, a brand really is to do with the emotional connection that someone has with a product or a service. It's a reason that someone chooses one thing over the other. Once you can get that happening, then you've started to create a brand. There's a reason why I choose Adidas trainers over Nike, because I just believe they're better for me. And that sort of sense of belief is what we're trying to do. I read The Guardian, not the Daily Telegraph. I buy Apple products. I've never owned anything by Samsung. But all those other products and services are all well and good. It's just not the choice that I want to make. So as business owners, what we're trying to do all the time is get people to choose our products and services over the competition. And by having that emotional connection with our audience, we will start to actually allow them to choose us instead. So if you think about naming, so why is naming important? Well, there is a fashion for some brands to not even have names anymore. Everyone recognizes the Nike tick. Starbucks took its brand name off mainly off its packaging a few years ago. And that's because they've been on a long journey. They've spent a lot of time creating those brands and that emotional connection, that the name becomes less important. But we're not there yet. So naming is the way that we're going to actually build our following and connect with our audience, and so that they can talk about us, they can share things about us, they can even just find us on a Google search engine. But all the time, that name is reinforcing the emotional connection that we want our audience to get. If you think back in time, we've always used symbols as a way of communicating. It just takes a long time for those symbols to have meaning. So, Egyptian hieroglyphics is great language, but you need to understand the code, if you like. So again, we can't really fast track to using symbols. Branding itself was originated through stamping cattle with marks. Again, just symbols to simply enable us to recognize one herd of cows from a different herd of cows. But there was no really big communication program going on with this. There wasn't any searching into Google about looking for our cows. It was just really a very physical, practical way of actually identifying things. And again, we all use emojis in communication in our mobile phones. And that's great because people know what those symbols mean, although sometimes those symbols can also get misinterpreted. So from a brand point of view, we really need to think about the name. When you get as big as Apple, then that's fine. You can just put an icon of an apple and everyone knows what your product and service is. And I hope that you all do get as big and successful as Apple by following this process. So if you think about Apple as well, you're also aware that, they do still need to use names. They still need to use words. They have lots of different products and services, Apple phone, Apple Watch, Apple Music, Apple TV. And then the naming is still really important. And module 5 will go into this in a little bit more depth, but it's still not good enough just to get away with a symbol. If you think about how words develop over time, and think about everyday things like animals, things that people now have as pets, probably started this several 100,000 years ago, but probably more like 15,000 years ago. People started to have animals around them, more from social point of view rather than hunting, etc. And they would have thought, well, this one is protecting me, this one's kind of fun. They would be thinking about the characteristics of those particular animals, and at some point they will have had to come up with a name to give it a collective term, if you like, a label for what that animal is. And as we know, this is a dog, and the term dog actually comes from Old English, so that's probably about 1500 years ago that people sort of thought the collective term for this group of animals should be a dog. So you can see there, dogger was the actual name that the Old English that the name dog derives from, that we're all very comfortable with. But actually just calling something dog, labeling like that, isn't that useful when you think about multiple dogs. If you want to attract your own dog and just shouting dog at it, it's probably not going to come to you. So then people start to actually create more meaningful names that have a stronger emotional connection. Obviously, Fido being one of the archetypal dog names. And actually, that was created about 200 years ago. It's Latin, from the Latin derivative of Fides, by Abraham Lincoln. He was the first person to actually call a dog Fido. Not surprisingly, that became very popular because he was a very popular president, and that name stuck. And all of a sudden then you've got a connection between the dog and the owner that actually is very strong and compelling. I'm sure if you've had pets in your time, you've given them great names and you've always enjoyed the relationship you've had with that pet. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our brand names and our brands. So in the warm-up task, I sort of asked you to have a look at what seemed to be some very unusual brand names: Pear, Stella Studs, Forest, Take Talk, Z Crate, My TV. Now, these names are only really unusual because you haven't really seen them before. And when you start to think about what those brand names are in reality, because these are like cryptic little clues, then they start to become more obvious. So if you just reveal a couple there, Take Talk, well, Snapchat. Snapchat's quite an odd name when you think about it. Even YouTube, when it's actually about your own television, why didn't they call it My TV? But YouTube is the name that they've got. That's what we're all used to. 7-Up, you know, name for a soft drink. It's probably got a story behind it. It's probably something to do with 7 days a week and feeling positive. And that's what you find with brand names, that they have these little stories behind them. And that's, again, what we're trying to build when we actually create a brand name. So there's the rest of them. Obviously, you can download the answer sheet in the workbook at the end of this session as well. So brand names become familiar and then they become accessible. So if they look a little bit unusual to begin with, don't worry about it. It's about gaining that familiarity. Now, we've got to do that as efficiently as possible, but don't expect it to be as famous overnight as, say, Amazon. It does take quite a while for people to actually get used to these names. So once you are familiar with names, it's actually good to look at actually the different types of names that are out there. And there's probably really 5 categories that I really look at in terms of the types of names. And I'm going to take you through these. So there's, you know, the real words, there's made up words, there's mashed up words, people and places, and descriptive names. And these are all different ways to help orientate the sort of brand names that may be successful for you. So if you just look at some real names at the moment, so you've got very literal words, you know, an apple is an apple, you know, Amazon is actually a river, you can zoom something, it is like a TV. Whereas you do also have something that is a little bit more obscure, and you probably need to understand the story behind it. So, you know, Nike is the goddess of victory. So there is a little story, you know, even Virgin, which is a very odd name for a brand. They called it that probably because, well, I think it was because of its newness. This is all about being original and new. So it seemed very good and fresh at the time. It's just become more established as we've been familiar with the Virgin brand over the last 30 or 40 years. So literal and obscure, but they've got something behind them. Lots of brands have made up names. Some kind of fall into several categories. One is about misspelling, so taking a word, jumbling up the letters a little bit, and that's really these days about trying to get ownership of that word, because the chances are the URL has gone or something like that. Obviously, prefixes and suffixes are very helpful to give us ownership of words. So, you know, Xbox and eBay being prefixes, but just putting words at the end of known words like if I and ist actually help kind of create a unique name. And actually some words are just totally made up. You know, Kodak isn't a word at all. They actually used a random name. I think it was a anagram maker to come up with the name Kodak, and they just picked it because they liked it, and it is a great name. So you can make up the names. That is very hard because you can't really build a story behind it. So I tend to stay away from purely made up names, although Kodak is a brilliant name. The other way of looking at names is through what I call mashup. So kind of sticking things together. Again, that's become really popular more recently because of the prevalence of being able to own it. So if you think that most words in the dictionary have been owned as a URL, not all are compounds. So you know, adding face and book. You all know the story. It was supposed to be called the Facebook before it became Facebook. You know, it's an easy way of doing something that actually has some instant ownability. The other way of doing this is blend. So take two longer words, you know, microcomputer and software, and then create Microsoft. So blend two words together. And also contractions. It's sort of similar to blends, but it's actually finding a word. So Doradito, which is the Spanish word for little friend and golden thing, which is a brilliant word. Well, let's take the A and D out of there. We don't really like that. And we've got Doritos, which is a great name. And again, because we're familiar with it, it actually feels quite normal these days. Another category, you know, very well established, you know, brands. A lot of brands have founders, you know, names of people that are actually, you know, set up those businesses in the first place. And because there's a lot of heritage and sort of humanity behind some brands as well, you know, actually knowing that person, or there was a person who was responsible for this, is a great way of connecting it. Again, it takes a long time to become as established as maybe Kellogg's and Ferrari's, and you do have to actually have the success that goes with it. But other brands just take the fictional approach. So Starbucks actually is a character from Moby Dick. They were going to be called Pequod, which is after the ship in Moby Dick, but they changed their name to Starbucks. But someone somewhere thought, that would make a great name for a coffee brand, and so it has. And then obviously locations and places are really important as well for naming. You see a lot of this in places like, you know, drinks and soft drinks and things like that, because they're actually have roots in a location or an area. But locations can also be fictitious locations, or totally made up, depending on what inspires you really, and what is relevant to your brand. And we'll come on to that into the module 2 a little bit more detail. And then the final sort of type of naming is descriptive names, and these sort of fall into two camps. We've got the acronyms, very famous, you know, IBM, etc. But again, it's still great if they've got a story behind it. So IKEA, you know, the I and the K is the name of the founder, Ingar Kampard, and I won't try and pronounce the next two parts, but the E is the farm that near where he grew up, and the A is the village. So there's a great story in that, which actually really helps make that a great name, as well as it being a great brand. And I think, you know, that it's probably not surprising that some of these great brands are successful because they do have great names. But again, they have to become familiar. Obviously, you know, in the descriptive section as well, messaging, you know, actually building a message or your mission into the name helps. So Compare the Market, which is a price comparison site, you know, it's just doing what it says on the tin. Toys R Us, we love toys. Honest Burgers, you kind of know what you're going to get from a shop or a brand that is called Honest Burgers. And so building your message in, and there's difficulties around that as well, but it can really help you get your message across to people just straight through the name. So just like before, there's a small task for you to do, and just building on some of those thoughts. I thought what would be interesting is if you think of a brand that you love, so just a brand, you know, any brand, it doesn't really matter, and then just discover the story behind the name. Put it into Google, you know, brand X origin story, or brand X origin, or whatever it might be, and then try and identify which categories those brands that you love fall in. So you show an example. So, you know, I love Adidas. You know, they're my favorite trainers, the Adidas Sambas, and you know, kind of the story behind the name is fairly straightforward. So they, you know, the founder was called Adolf Dassler, and his nickname was Addy. So straight away, you've got a very short story there that it's named after the founder, and actually they've mashed the two bits together and then contracted it slightly to get Adidas. So his nickname and part of his surname creates the Adidas brand. So, you know, hopefully that's giving you a little bit of insight into the types of names that are out there, and we'll use this as inspiration for the sort of names that would be right for your business. As I say, there's a worksheet, so you can download that and, you know, refer back to the categories, but try it a couple of times. It gets quite addictive, I must say, once you start looking around at your favorite brands and uncovering the story. And I'd be really interested to know what brand stories you uncover about the brands that you love, and share them with me. If you need any support, come to me as well. The next module is going to be about, you know, the things that you need to put in place. It's a bit more of the business mechanics behind naming a brand. And thank you very much for your time. Enjoy yourself thinking of brand name stories finding out and discovering what your brand story is and how it connects with you. And if you need anything else, then please get in touch, just email me, or I join my Facebook group where I can also be there from time to time supporting you. So enjoy your Module 1 task.